In this video, I'm going to describe the steps involved with calculating the standard deviation. I'm also going to show you the standard deviation formula and unpack it so you understand each of the elements of the formula. So the standard deviation I mentioned first is a very popular measure of variability. Now I mentioned in the textbook first the range, which is a very basic measure of variability, the smallest and the largest value in the data set. Standard deviation is more complicated, but also much more useful, and it's also very popular. So the calculation of the standard deviation involves 6 steps. First, calculate the mean. That is something that has been demonstrated already. The mean, as you might recall, is the same as the average. Then you calculate the deviations from the mean, and that means that each case's value is subtracted from the mean, and then you square those deviations. And then you sum the squared deviations, and then you divide the sums of squares by n minus 1, which is basically taking an average. The standard deviation is essentially an average itself. It's an average deviation representation. And then we square root the result from 5 in order to get the actual standard deviation. So here's the formula. I mentioned before the first step is calculate the mean, and the mean in the formula is right here. So that is a representation of the mean. X bar is the first step. And then the second step is to calculate the deviations from the mean. So each case has a value. So if we use the example of sleep, a person might sleep 6 hours a night, and the average is something like 7 or 8. Well, we need to calculate the difference between a case's value and the mean, and we do that for each case. And this subscript I just means one case minus the mean, and we need to square each deviation. So each person's deviation from the mean needs to be squared. Otherwise, we would end up with 0. And then step 5 is dividing the sums of squares by a value that is close to n. It's n minus 1. And in the textbook, I describe why we use n minus 1 rather than the more intuitive n. So you just have to remember that we have to divide by n minus 1. So we're nearly there. The last step is to square root the value that you get after the division, n minus 1. So you get the result of dividing the numerator by the denominator, and then you square root. The mistake I see students make when they're doing this by hand is they forget to do the square rooting in order to get the actual standard deviation. So this formula, which is the biggest formula I've shown thus far in the textbook, seems intimidating at first sight, but when you break it down, they're all terms that are familiar to you already. And I think it's a very eloquent, concise way to represent all of these words here. So that's why formulae are so useful, is that they are a concise way to represent a number of steps involved with calculations. So that is the standard deviation. It's the standard deviation formula, and those are the steps involved with calculating the standard deviation if you were to do it by hand.